Hello, good evening, everyone. I hope you can see the screen properly. I'm just going to introduce this event. I'm the chairman of British-Yemeni Society, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. We've had a series of events recently looking at the different dimensions of Yemen's war and the rather elusive prospects for peace. So it's really good to have a change and to be discussing this evening's topic of Yemen's rich culture. That culture has taken quite a battering in recent years since the outpouring of creativity that marked Yemen's Arab Spring. Architecture and heritage sites have been bombed, while authorities, nervous about free expression during this bitterly fought war, have often reacted with quite repressive policies. But through all this, the indomitable spirit of Yemenis has continued to shine through. I recommend to you a report published only a couple of weeks ago by the Yemen Policy Center and CAPO. It's entitled "Broken People Can't Heal a Nation, the Role of the Arts in Peace Building in Yemen." So quoting from this, despite seemingly insurmountable challenges, writers, poets, painters, illustrators, photographers, musicians, comedians, yes, even comedians, filmmakers and theatre groups across Yemen continue to find avenues to produce and share their work. Street artist Murad Subai, you may have heard of him, commented, "I know art won't feed the poor, but it can at least deliver a message and express the pain that people feel." So I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. That's Professor Kamal Abu-Deeb. He will be well known to many of you, and indeed many of you in the audience may have been taught by him and will remember his inspiring and often, I understand, rather unorthodox lectures. Professor Kamal is originally from Syria, another country benighted by war, but his career spans universities in the UK, US, Sweden, India, and for the best part of a decade at Sana'a University, I think in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He's currently Emeritus Professor of Arabic at the University of London, and he's one of the most well-known Arab literature critics and researchers in modern time, with numerous publications and a number of literary prizes. So this evening, Kamal is going to speak to us for around 40 minutes on this theme, cultural politics and the symbolic power of art and architecture, drawing, I understand, largely on his experience in Yemen. This will be followed by a short commentary from Sheffield poet and BYS trustee, Hamdan Dammag, who has been a central player in organizing this event. Now, many have asked that we record this event. It's Ramadan starting tomorrow, so some people are busy preparing for that. And in the UK, pubs and restaurants are opening in a limited fashion from tonight. So this may be affecting our live audience, although I see we have an enormous number of people attending. So the meeting is going to be entirely on the record. As we speak, as Kamal speaks, please send in your questions using the Q&A button, and we will try and ensure that as many of these as possible are covered in that Q&A for the last 20 minutes or so before the meeting closes at around 7:15. So Kamal, can I pass over to you, please?
Thank you very much, James, for your very kind words, much of which I don't deserve, but very nice to hear them anyway. This is really not an academic exercise. It's not a lecture in the academic sense. And when I asked to do whether I would talk to the society, I thought now with Yemen going through the horrors of everything it's been going through, with so much damage and destruction and oppression coming from all sorts of directions, it might be nice for me to talk to the society and give what I think of as a testimony, my own personal testimony to the greatness of a country that I've loved so much and I still love so much, and that I think of as one of the most wonderful countries I've lived in, though I've lived in many places, and one of the most dramatic examples of the history of the uh, Arab world, as well as its modern period in which it aspired to go through the uh, uh, Enlightenment um, on one level and to be modern in the technical sense, in the real sense of the word, on the other, in another sense. That testimony will take the form of looking at four aspects of um, these experiences I went through while in Yemen that will bring together some of the most beautiful and some of the most mysterious and enigmatic aspect that I've experienced in this most wonderful of countries. And to start with, I want to think of the physical structure of the Yemen, of the way it's actually made, of the physical landscape, and how the landscape interacts with the human being and how the human being responds to the landscape. And already on that very initial level, Yemen is dramatic, striking, exciting, mysterious, puzzling, rich, challenging, and also it embodies the finest and the most powerful aspect of the human spirit in its response to the environment in which man lives. Toward the end of my stay there, my family joined me for a visit. My youngest daughter was at the time about 11, I think. And we were on the way to Sada. And the uh, driver stopped at one point for us to get out of the car and just have a look. And this youngest daughter stepped out of the car and then she went, oh, and she said, "This is majestic." And I thought, what a wonderful word coming from an 11-year-old, because we were facing the high mountains, the steep slopes, the rocky mountain, yet the valleys, the depths of the valleys, the green valleys and the bare mountains, and it was stunning. And the clouds were surrounding everything, and a mixture of mystery and physical beauty of an impossible nature to describe was brought about by this word majestic. And Yemen is majestic. It's the product, of course, geologically, it's the product of volcanoes. And it's these mountains, these majestic mountains, these mysterious valleys, which together, in a sense, gave me the feeling of what Yemen is about. As you looked at this, and then you realize that what you were seeing on the very top of these mountains were actually buildings. When you looked through the clouds, you saw these were trees, these were bare rocks, these were uh, part of the physical nature of the place. And suddenly you discovered that what you were seeing were actually buildings, villages, sometimes individual, singular buildings at the very highest point in a mountain. And you say, how on earth was this built? Did it come down from heavens already structured like this? Or was it really built by a human being? you wondered whether you were going to believe in jinns and the way they're said to have built X and Y and Z of the world mysterious building. Yemen gives you this feeling that there are jinns around, that there magic around which is responsible for producing what you see in the physical landscape. And then the clouds clear up and you look towards the valleys and you see the lines, green line, line upon line, upon line, upon line. And as you look closely and you can see the visibility improves, you realize that these were actually pieces of land, the width of each of which is no more than about 2 meters, sometimes less than 2 meters flat. And they're cut and built with walls which are about 2 meters high. In other words, human beings or jinns have cut the mountain up into layers that start at the beginning of the valley and end up at the very top of the mountain. And you realize that this is agricultural land, agricultural strips which have been snatched out of the very heart of the mountain, which otherwise would have been impossible to get any fertility out of. But how much human effort, what sort of spirit, what great human spirit had the power, the patience, the courage to challenge the landscape to produce out of these steep, impossible mountains agricultural strips which produce the food for people to survive. I could kneel down and say, blessed be man, because almost, it's literally almost miraculous to see what the Yemenis have done with their mountains and how they snatched their food over decades, centuries, God knows how long, out of a physical landscape which can give so much but not food. And yet they produced this wonderful landscape, which of course did two things. In addition to providing the agricultural land and the production of food, it also created some of the most beautiful sights that you could see anywhere in the world. From that landscape to the plains of Ma'rib, where the first dam that we know of historically to irrigate wild plains was built and destroyed, and through its building and destruction, we have civilizations that match the civilizations of the other part of the Middle East, which is Syria and Iraq and the Mesopotamian areas between them. These were the two centers of civilization which produced what we now know is the Arab world. And that top, these tops of these mountains which had those fantastic buildings made me think, and I said this to my friends in the Maqil, I said, you Yemenis have the mentality of the eagle. And they found the phrase rather nice. They would repeat it sometimes. Only eagles go this high and have the power to reach this high to a place that can't be reached by man. Only eagles can reach to build their nest. But Yemenis build their nest just as eagles build their nest. The Yemenis' nest were villages or individual buildings, some of which I'll show you in a minute. That to me was the spirit, the eye of the eagle, but also the absolute freedom that the eagle enjoys and lives in and for. It's that spirit of freedom then that I began to contemplate. And I found a wonderful expression of it in a poem that, in a book, in fact, that's written by the most important critic, poet, writer, educator in Yemen, my dear intimate friend Abdulaziz al-Maqaleh. And I decided that I want to read you a piece from his book on love, that in which he identifies love and freedom as a pair without which human life cannot survive. So I'll start with this and let you contemplate, because I translated that very quickly. You can see it later and contemplate what this wonderful piece tells us about the spirit of a Yemeni, major Yemeni figure who feels, in a sense, who feels Yemen within his own heart and soul to represent both of these items, love and freedom. And so I'd like to ask my great friend Hamdan Dammag, the son of my other intimate friend who left us a number of years ago, the wonderful novelist and short story writer Zaid Mutir Dammag. And to these two, I would like to dedicate this talk of mine, to Abdulaziz Maqaleh and to Zaid Mutir Dammag, and the other friends of the Maqil, about which I'll be talking later. So if you would do me a favor, please, I'm done, and let's have this. I'll read it for you in Arabic quickly so that you can, some of you might enjoy the sound of Arabic, but also feel the rhythm of it, because the rhythm of it is very much part of the tenderness of love, and the structure of it is part of the freedom of poetry, about which I'll be talking a bit more after I read this. قليل من الحب يكفي ليجعل من كلمة وردة وكتابا إذا انداح فوق السطور الشذا. إذا انداح فوق السطور الشذا اخضر وجه العدو بما لم تكن أضمرت روحه واستعاد شفيف براءته. اغتسل القلب في كلمات الفرح. Next, please. If لو كان البحر مدادا والحب كلاما نفد البحر. The reference is to the Quran here. لو كان البحر مدادا والحب كلاما نفد البحر وما نفدت كلمات الحب. الحب هو الله. الحب هو الله العاطفة الأسمى والأنبل والأجمل. قلب لا يسكنه الحب محال أن تسكنه الرحمة أو يسكنه حب الله. الحب والحرية. That's the poem now which combines the two together. الإنسان الخائف لا يعرف معنى الحب ولا يدرك معنى للورد ولا معنى للموسيقى. قلب حجره الخوف محاط بثعابين القمع وأدمته صياط الجلادين. يظل غريبا عنه الحب فلا حب بلا حرية. ثمة أكثر من حب في دنياك، وثمة أكثر من محبوب. دع قلبك حرا مفتوحا للنور. دع قلبك حرا مفتوحا للنور، وروحك مشرعة للتغيير. فلا خوف من الحب ولا خوف من الحرية. أيتها الحرية يا شمس الروح وماء الحب، ويا حلم الإنسان، اقتربي منا، اقتربي منا، يقترب الحب، ونخرج من أقبية الظلمة. In that amazing way, Abdulaziz Makalih, in a book which is published exactly in this period when Yemen has been exposed to all the destruction and oppression and hatred and antagonism and war, sings for freedom and love, and see them together as the way to rise out of the basement of darkness. A little love suffices to turn a word into a rose. In the book, when the fragrance wafts over the lines, the face of an enemy blossoms into what his spirit had not intended, and he regains his transparent innocence, and the heart bathes in the waters of joy. This is English. I don't need to comment on it. You can read it at home and feel it at home. If had the sea been ink and love been words, the sea will dry up and the words of love will not. Love is God. That's Christ speaking. Allahu mahabba. Love is God, the most sublime emotion, the most noble, the most beautiful. A heart not inhabited by love can never be inhabited by mercy or inhabited by the love of God. The unification of God and love, and God and freedom and love, the most amazing spirit produces such language and such work in the midst of all the destruction that's happening. And now I'll read Love and Freedom a little quickly because of the time. A frightened person does not know the meaning of love, nor does he know the meaning of roses, nor the meaning of music. For a heart turned into stone by fear, besieged by the snakes of oppression, and bleeding because of the whips of executioners, will remain a stranger to love, and love a stranger to him. There is no love without freedom. There is no love without freedom, which means there's nothing without freedom. There are more than one love in your world. You can read it as there is more than one love in your world. I prefer it this way. And more than one beloved. Let your heart be free, open to the light, and your soul wide open to change. There's nothing to fear in love. There's nothing to fear in freedom. Oh, freedom, oh, liberty. You are the sun of the soul, the water of love, and the dream of man. Come close to us. Love will come close to us. And we will emerge from the basements of darkness. It's this spirit that seeks to emerge from the basement of darkness with the assistance of love and freedom And as they combine with God and become love, become God, God becomes love, consequently, God becomes freedom. Is this spirit which I want to now follow a bit in the achievement of these two writers mostly and the generation of younger writers that they have influenced and who learned from them so much. And here I want to be brief because I want to move then to the next point where I want to deal with the architectural aspect. Now, in this in this particular aspect, I think the achievement of the Yemeni cultural creators is genuinely as astounding as Yemen itself. When you think of a country which was the source of so much of Arabic culture in the pre-Islamic period and the Islamic period, and yet it went through darkness, and suddenly out of this darkness, as recently as the 1960s, it began to open up and display creative powers which in other Arab countries had been going on for 2 centuries or 1.5 centuries before they produced what they produced. In Yemen, over the period I'm talking about is only over about 2.5 decades. Yet between 1960 and 1988 and so forth, when I was doing some writing about this, in quarter of a century, writers in Yemen, artists in Yemen, musicians in Yemen, Yemeni people themselves brought about a project, carried on a project of enlightenment as fast as the light itself. Europe went through the age of enlightenment over 2 centuries. Yemen went through enlightenment in 2 months, I would say. I'm exaggerating a bit. You can imagine what they have managed to do when you think that Abdulaziz Maqaleh was a student at Cairo when, as recently as the late 60s and 70s, and yet in no time he was one of the pioneers of Arabic poetry and Arabic literary criticism, but he was also the pioneer in Yemen of education as the head of the great universities that I had the honor of teaching at the University of Sana'a. His passion for education was very much part of his passion for change. That's why he said in this poem, keep your heart open for change, because change was the key to the future. He says in the introduction to his book, it's on the future that I bet. Despite all the destruction, he's still betting on the future. This faith in the future carried through this project of enlightenment and turned it very quickly into a project of a quest for modernity. Other Arab regions like Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Egypt had started those projects a century before, a century and a half before. And yet Abdulaziz Maqaleh and Zayd Muti' Dammag and other writers and poets were producing material that stands equal to anything which was produced in the Arab world at the time. And the generation of writers, which includes this young man sitting there, Hamdan, the son of Zayd Muti' Dammag, are now producing work which stand equal to the work of their generation in the rest of the Arab world. And that is no mean achievement. That is, in fact, the best thing that happened in Yemen over the past 100 years. It carried on a project of enlightenment and modernity that gave and emphasized the most significant and noblest of values in human society. Because that project was a mixture of nationalism in the narrow sense of Yemeni nationalism and the wider sense of Arab nationalism, and socialism in the wider sense of Marxism and the narrower sense of socialism as we knew it in the Arab world, even in Britain in a sense, where it's not communism, but so Yemen is that country which had only had proper schools and a university very recently, had Marxist thinkers, Marxist writers, Marxist critics, side by side with Arab nationalists, side by side with Yemeni nationalists, side by side with others about whom I'll say a few words later when I begin to talk about the problematic that came as a result of that. And it produced the first Marxist regime anywhere outside the European space. And I think I'm not wrong. Maybe, I'm sorry, I forgot Castro. Okay, the first Marxist regime in the Arab world itself, at least in the Middle East. Can you imagine that? From the darkness of the Imam, which went on until what, the 1960, 62 revolution, 63 was it? And what within this time, you have a Marxist regime in one part of Yemen, and you have a nationalist struggle. And I begin now to talk about the sad story. You had a nationalist struggle that is now in conflict with its own people because of the rise of Islamic, i.e. religious nationalism. And that was the period which I witnessed in all its intensity. I lived it, I took part in it, I wrote about it, I talked about it, and I did not celebrate it because it was the period which began to show that the great modernist project, the great project of enlightenment and modernity had a crack within its own structure, identical to the crack which the project to which I've made my contributions throughout my life, which is the modernity, the quest for modernity in the Arab world at large, had in its own structure. And that crack is this: the ideological structure that we've created, and now I talk as a Yemeni writer, because it doesn't matter. I was doing the same thing that Abdulaziz Maqaleh and Zaid were doing, although I'm Syrian. We were doing the same thing. But the project that we created had a massive influence on the younger generation, but it had very little or negligible influence on the older generation. In other words, the structure of thought and feeling that dominated Yemen and the Arab world between, I would say, 1400 and 1900 remained conventional, traditional, religious, Islamic, full stop. And it is that structure which have created the dark ages to some extent of the Arab world, including Yemen. And that was rising up again. I lived it in Jordan, I lived it in Yemen, and I lived in Yemen the conflict between friends and colleagues and people sitting together in the Maqil, about which I'll say a few words now. And yet they were inside, they were enemies. And when Abdulaziz said that love makes the heart of the enemy blossoms, I think he was hoping that this would be true. Unfortunately, it wasn't true. The heart of the enemy didn't know the love in the first place, and it didn't blossom. And we witnessed some of the worst, most aggressive, most devastating and negative rise of the Islamic current in Yemen, fed by the Saudis in particular and by other conventional traditional forces in the region. And we proved to ourselves, in fact, that our project was not strong enough to survive. And that began to cause a shift. It was a shift which I saw in the writings of Abdulaziz Maqaleh and Zaid Muti' Dammag and others while we were going through it. Because from the great project of enlightenment and modernity, from the great socialist, nationalist, writing about the poor and the deprived and those who are crushed, from those, as Abdulaziz Maqaleh said, who are besieged by the snakes of oppression and bleeding because of the whips of the executioners, from all this project, which was about those, about freeing people, about establishing a future, aspiring to a future and creating a future. All this project did not have the strength to stand in the face of the rise of a conventional, backward-looking Islamic tradition. And the battle is still going on. It's not over yet. But in Yemen in particular, sadly, we've seen that this led to the fragmentation that I've talked about so much when I was in Yemen, but it came to Yemen a little later, although it took the form first of the collapse of the union between the South and the North. But that was the dramatic side of the project that I've just described. And I can't predict now the future of that. I will be coming back to close with towards at the end of my talk. But in between, I want to deal with another aspect that attracted my attention greatly in those years which I spent there. I could always feel that in so many aspects of the culture, of the social order, there was an inside and an outside.